Hey, Rob Cairns, CEO and Chief Creator of Amazing Ideas at StunningDigitalMarketing.com, the Toronto agency that helps your marketing and web development needs soar and generates leads that convert to conversions for your business. Today's episode, I'm with my good friend Eric Jacksch. Eric is based out of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and is a security expert in the computer security field. Today we talk a little bit about what individuals can do to protect themselves at home, what businesses can do to protect themselves in their business, and sit back and relax and enjoy the ride and the conversation with Eric Jacksch. Hey everybody, Rob Cairns here. I'm here with my friend Eric Jacksch, and Eric is an online or a network security expert. And, you know, with all the advantages of what's been going on in the world, I thought we'd sit and talk security for a while and try and bring some people up to speed on what's going on. How are you, Eric?
Good. Yourself, Rob?
Doing really good. The security is kind of the wild, wild west right now, isn't it? A little bit.
Well, we're getting there. Certainly, there's an awful lot going on.
Yeah, there's way too much going on. So, and Erica and I have known each other for a long time now, a number of years. And I thought I'd get Eric to tell us a little bit about himself and what he does and what he's doing and some of the cool projects he's working on. Eric?
All righty. Well, I'm a cybersecurity specialist. So for those of you who don't know me, I've spent about the last 25 years helping governments and businesses of all size protect themselves in a number of capacities, from high-level risk assessments covering entire organizations down to testing hardware and software.
Yeah, which is kind of cool field, and it's always evolving, and that's what people don't realize. Security is not a stagnant, it's like a moving target. So what is the biggest security challenge you think today, Eric, in the world?
Well, I guess I need to caveat the answer by saying that it depends on who you are and what business you're in. In general, one of the biggest challenges that I see is that most product developers are continuing to emphasize features instead of security and privacy. And as consumers, we've traditionally been okay with that. It's easy to point at developers and saying they're not considering security, but developers and people who develop products hopefully are developing what consumers want. And until consumers start demanding more in the way of security and privacy, there's little incentive for product developers to shift their priorities. So I think that's one of the major areas that is holding us back.
I would agree with you. I mean, it's people seem concerned about the shiny new syndrome instead of fixing what they already have, and I think that's a bit of an ongoing issue kind of in the marketplace. Besides the corporate side, and, you know, a lot of people who listen and spend time online are home users. And I don't always think home users do a really good job. And one of the things I hear a lot from home users is, do I need virus protection or malware protection on my computers? What do you think about that?
Well, again, that depends on your operating system. But I think it's important to take a step back. The first line of defense that people have is their own behavior. So if you're going online and you're downloading software from sources you don't recognize, and you're going to sketchy websites, and you're opening every email attachment that you get, there's really no software out there that is going to protect you. They can help, but if you choose to behave in that way, you're going to have problems. Now, if you're running a Windows computer, definitely you need antivirus software on it, because most of the malware out there is targeting the Windows platform. A question I get asked all the time, and I'm sure you get this as well, is, well, which antivirus package should I buy? Well, if you're behaving responsibly online, probably Windows Defender that you've already paid for with Windows, it's probably adequate for most people. In fact, some of the free antivirus software out there has been more problematic than it's worth. Some of those packages have actually introduced serious security problems. So I tell the average person, if you're not in a high risk situation, keep your Windows 10 machine up to date, and use Windows Defender that came with your computer. Microsoft really deserves, and I've not always been I've not always come down on Microsoft's side of this argument, but Microsoft has really done a good job in many ways of improving their defenses against malware, especially with Windows 10 and the latest versions of Windows 10 and how they've been evolving that. If you're running a Mac, it is true that Macs are intrinsically more malware resistant just because of some of the security features. However, if you want to download software to your Mac and your Mac is careful enough to say, hey, this is an unrecognized publisher, if you decide you want to install it anyway, well, then you've created that problem for yourself. So whether you need malware protection on a Mac, it depends how you use it. A lot of people don't, and they're fine. On the other hand, there are a couple good antivirus packages for Macs. If you're running Google Chrome, probably don't need to worry about it. They have a lot built in, and the Chromebooks are so easy to reset back to factory defaults, log back in, and get all your stuff back in a matter of a couple of minutes. It's probably not worth trying to load AV software on there if there was any available, and there typically isn't.
Yeah,
long answer to a short question, but
that's it. That's really good sound advice. I know personally the package I recommend, if it's not the free package, and I agree with you, Windows Defender's great, but if somebody really wants to go out and buy something, I've been kind of partial for a number of years, having come out of the corporate environment. And I'll be first say I don't like McAfee and I don't like Norton, which are the two big corporate products, because frankly they're resource intensive. The product that I tend to go with is the ESET product out of the States, ESET Not 32, or they're just because I find the resource allocation not as bad as some of the other corporate products.
I tend not to make specific recommendations or very general specific recommendations for specific products, just because, in the small business and corporate space, one of the differences is you want AV that does some centralized reporting so that you can track malware infections, track whether things are up to date, etc. If you look at the field of antivirus, it has traditionally come from a signature model where the products recognize what's quote unquote bad based on a set of signatures that needs to be updated pretty much constantly. Some of the vendors have introduced more. They say AI. We talk more in the machine learning space. Have added some basic things there, and there's some newer products. Not necessarily saying they're better, but there's some newer and I think very promising products that are using strictly machine learning. For example, Cylance, which was recently bought by BlackBerry of
all people.
Yeah, BlackBerry. Cylance was one of the first to go straight machine learning. And it also, that product is extremely lightweight and not constantly downloading signatures. So it really depends on what your objective is. Again, for home users that think they have a malware problem, Malwarebytes often does a really good job of detecting and
been around a long time.
People don't want to forward to it. And they now have a product that does real-time protection. So there's a lot out there, but I always caution people that they're not putting on a suit of armor, and that even if they are using anti-malware products, they still need to think about their behavior before they click on that link, surf to that sketchy website, or open attachments to email that may not be trustworthy.
I agree with you. And then becomes my next question. I have all the stuff and tools, but my data's not going to go anywhere. What's your thought about backups and what people should do, and that whole rabbit hole of should I, shouldn't I, should I spend the time, shouldn't I?
Well, again, it depends what you have on your computer. On one end of the spectrum, we have people who use Chromebooks, which essentially store nothing on their computer, and it's all in the cloud. In that case, they really have nothing to back up. On the other hand, a lot of people have their extensive photo albums, family documents, business documents, etc., and they definitely need to be backing them up, especially with the kind of malware, and particularly the ransomware incidents that we're seeing. It often turns out that a good backup, particularly a good offsite backup, is really your final line of defense in many scenarios. I often get the question, I think you've alluded to it a little bit, of do I back my data up locally, or do I
Yes.
or do I use a service? If you have the discipline to take backups regularly onto a USB drive, take them off-site or store somewhere else, if you have that discipline to do that, it's workable. In my experience, though, most people, especially small business people who perhaps are the most vulnerable because they typically don't have an IT department and they don't have, a lot of time, they're busy. My experience that those backups tend to be well-intentioned but kind of fall off and don't happen. And for that reason, I recommend that most people use a cloud-based backup service. There used to be so there still are several of them out there. In this particular place, there is really one service that stands out for individuals and small business, and that's Backblaze. Some of the other services have either gone away from an all-you-can-eat model, or they've shifted just toward the business business area. Backblaze is screaming fast. It's one of the services that will back up about as fast as your internet service will provide. It's pretty low maintenance, and their cost is pretty reasonable. So that's typically what I'm pointing my friends, neighbors, and small business customers toward these days.
I would agree with you, and it's funny worth noting, there was a well-known tech journalist in the States about 8 years ago, and he took all his backups, and he had a break into his house. The only problem is the 2 backup drives were sitting next to the computer, so when the thief swiped the laptop, he took the backup drives, and that kind of ended that discussion. So the point is that Eric was just making was, if you're going to do backups, you have to have an offsite solution as part of it. Fires happen, theft happens, floods happen, unfortunately. I don't know about you, Eric, but I don't think over the years I've ever lost an ounce of data because of backups. Like, that's just, I've had hard drives go, but I've never lost anything. Have you?
I've never lost anything important, but again, working in this field and doing some, I do some business continuity, disaster recovery planning for small business as well. So it's always been something that mindful. I've seen a lot of people lose a lot of data. Also, related to that, if we look at the whole area of ransomware, where we even see government agencies sometimes paying to get their data back. Yeah. When that's happening, again, I don't have inside knowledge of any of those, but that screams lack of backups there. If you have a proper backup and using a service like Backblaze, which is constantly backing up your data when you're connected, when you're online, then if you were to run into ransomware, the situation is very simple. Delete everything on your hard drive, wipe your drive, reinstall the operating system, and get your data from a backup. And one of the reasons, again, I don't make any money off them. I have no business relationship other than as a customer with Backblaze, but they will even courier you a courier backup to you if you need to recover your data quickly. And that's just a fantastic service.
It sure is. So let's move on a little bit to the world of smartphones. We all have them in our hand. Is there any security issues with smartphones?
Well, plenty. And I think the number one thing with smartphones is, like any other computer, and we have to realize that they're not phones anymore. We say it's my phone, but the reality is we're now carrying a computer in our pocket. Like any other computer, it needs to be kept up to date. The operating system, the apps need to be kept up to date. And even though Google and Apple are both doing a decent job in many cases to try to stop malware from slipping through their official stores, it does happen. So like any other computer, we need to be cognizant of what we're installing on it, how we're using it, and keep in mind that the smartphone has progressed to be a lot more than a phone. We're carrying a lot of information in our pocket. So we want to turn on the security features to require us to authenticate the device. And people just need to simply ask themselves that question: if I were to accidentally leave this in a taxi, on a bus, if I were to drop it walking down the street and somebody else picked it up, what would they be able to get into? And because that is a scenario that somebody faces on a daily basis.
Yep, so true. Now moving on to the corporate world a little bit. What is the biggest threat for corporations in today's day and age?
Well, I'm going to have to be very general to answer that, because the biggest threat for corporations. So looking at it at a high level, what we're seeing is two of the major things. Now, of course, we've talked about business continuity a little bit, and disaster recovery and what have you. And it's important to realize that people lose data and have their businesses damaged through accidents and natural disasters, and as well as criminal behavior. But what we're seeing is in most businesses are experiencing attempts to steal information and commit fraud. And traditionally we think of hacking and that image of a pimple teenager sitting in their basement. Well, that's not the reality today. Reality today is it's organized crime. There is organized fraud occurring. Most businesses are getting emails at some point, emails to employees that look like they come from executives. They don't, asking for information, asking for wire transfers, requesting financial information. So all-out fraud, and if we went back several decades, a lot of that was occurring by telephone. Now it's even easier for someone anywhere in the world to use email, instant messaging, SMS, and what have you, to contact employees and try to look like someone else. And of course, information theft. Now, depending what vertical you're in, there are different risks, and some verticals have significantly elevated risk because of the information they hold. So, if your business are in retail, finance sectors, obviously payment card information is something that's highly sought after and is being targeted because it's very easy for criminals to monetize. Tech companies generally have to worry about fraud, as I mentioned earlier, and intellectual property theft. And we've all, I'm not going to name any companies, but we've all heard the big stories about big Canadian companies being seriously damaged by intellectual property theft, and I think that remains a problem. And again, I think, particularly when I'm talking to small business owners, I always emphasize that yes, hacking is a problem, phishing is a problem, fraud, theft of information, and those are real problems. But somebody losing their laptop is a problem as well. Even with an encrypted hard drive, if the hard drive isn't encrypted, the data may be stolen. If a hard drive is encrypted, well, if there isn't a backup, you've now just lost you lost the data. Things get stolen, we're coming to springtime here in Ottawa. We had some flooding last year. We've got more snow here than we did last year. Hopefully, we're better prepared to handle it. But things like floods, electrical outages, and that can have a pretty significant impact. So we need to prepare for those type of events as well.
And I think the other thing we need to be aware of a little bit is the whole aspect of what's called social reengineering. There was a really good book written by the legendary hacker, Kevin Mitnick. For those who don't know, he's the one who actually hacked the FBI website a number of years ago, went to jail, and is now the FBI's biggest security consultant. But that's, typical in this industry often. And he wrote a book called The Art of Deception, and the book talks about the social impact on hacking, and that not everything is just a computer hack. It's that email that's deceptive, that guy walking in who walks his way through a password and somebody gives it up, or some guy who works his way into a computer room. And the more I see, the more in a lot of respects, I think people haven't learned. The same stuff is happening over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to admit I'm not a big fan of criminals who turn into security professionals. I'm not a big fan. If you do read some of the information on Kevin Mitnick, he certainly has expertise in the area of social engineering, and that is something that people do need to be very aware of, is that is alive well, and we're actually seeing an improvement on behalf of the social engineers. So they're getting better at it. It was only a couple of years ago we kind of would laugh at a lot of those emails. These emails would come in and they'd be a little far-fetched, and the English would be horribly awkward, or an email even saying it was from the CEO but spelling the CEO's name wrong.
Yeah.
And we would see those emails and we'd kind of chuckle about it. Well, it's not so funny anymore, because those folks have got much better at it. It is, these criminals are more organized. I'm hesitant to use the word organized crime, because then someone's going to ask me what disorganized crime would look like. But they are getting much better, much more slick, and organizations are being targeted, and what I mean by that is employees receive email that look like they come from someone else. Maybe the email address is slightly different, but it looks like they come from someone else in the company that would have a legitimate reason to ask for certain information or certain actions. The English is good. In some cases, we see evidence of the criminals even trying to use the writing style of the of the person that they're sending things on. We see crossover between into text messages. So, employees suddenly, we've gone from a scenario where employees are getting almost a laughable attempt at an email impersonation, to now they're actually getting text messages and emails that look quite convincing. So we need to be much better at spotting them and help employees to understand that threat and do a lot more in the area of security awareness training.
Oh, I would agree with that. And what is when we've talked a lot about what corporations should do, what's the one thing that most big corporations really don't do? Is there anything that kind of stands out in your world?
Well, again, it's difficult to generalize because different companies have different strengths and weaknesses, just as different people do. One of the trends that I see is that the message that security is everyone's job is not being delivered. And when you look at large companies, you may look at them, particularly if you're a small business owner, you say, oh, they've got a big security team. Well, it doesn't matter how big your security team is if they're always playing catch up to the rest of the business, or if they're operating in a silo, your security program isn't going to be effective. So security teams, or even if you have one security consultants or individuals, they need to be positioned better as advisors to the business. Yep. And ultimately, everyone in the business needs to accept responsibility for security. This area, give you an example, and people often like concrete example, is particularly evident in large businesses when it comes to patching systems and remediating security vulnerabilities. On one hand, you have a security team that's kind of sitting in a silo. If they happen, they're probably the ones that own the vulnerability scanner, and they're doing the scanning and producing reports and saying, here are all the issues that need to be addressed. But they don't have actual access to the systems that need to be patched, and for a multitude of very good reasons, they're not the right people to do it. On the other hand, the IT teams are busy, overworked, and they don't feel that they're responsible for security. So you end up with a situation where executives are expecting a security team to protect them, while IT teams, or some other part of the business, I'm not trying to pick on IT, I'm just using it as an example, but where they don't keep the systems they run up to date and properly configured. And in that situation, that in the business has little hope of success. So what needs to change is, we hear about a and I'm sure you've heard this in the media as well, there's a shortage of security people, or that. And part of the reason I think that there's an apparent shortage of security people is we don't know how to use them correctly yet. Mm-hmm. What we need to be doing is, if you're the business owner of a system, guess what? You win. You're responsible for the security of that system. Yeah. If you're assigned a laptop and a telephone by your company, you're responsible for the security of those. And what a security group's role needs to be is to provide advice, provide guidance, provide the right tools, and provide the right training and help shape the cybersecurity program. But until we get to the point that everyone clearly understands the business that security is their responsibility as well, it's really going to be hard for businesses, particularly for the larger businesses, to make a lot of progress in that area. While on the other hand, it's kind of interesting. A lot of smaller businesses get it. Even the smaller businesses that don't have a full-time security person, they get it. They know that every person is responsible, and they know that the system administrator that's running a system is responsible for keeping up to date. So in some ways, that message is working better in small business than it is for larger business.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And let's move on to the topic of web security. And this is like a kettle of fish.
Near and dear to your heart.
Oh, is it ever? And for those who don't know, I do 99% of my web design in WordPress, which is open source, the base core. And we hear all the time things like WordPress is not secure, this system's not secure, and kind of web security is a lot like the rest of the world, where it's more, 33% of the world using WordPress, so that makes it a target. That's the first problem. And what's the biggest issue in web security? Is it just people not keeping software up to date, or is it more than that?
Well, I think it's a bigger problem. First of all, realizing web is a very broad area, right? It encompasses a whole lot of technologies, a whole lot of systems, a whole lot of use cases. In general, we do a very poor job of architecting web applications to resist attack. Now, I don't mean that I'm not talking about the web designer who's building something to sit on top of WordPress. I'm talking more at an architectural level. Mm-hmm. For example, PHP, LampStack, commonly found all on the same machine. We very commonly look at, there's this multitude of security flaws we see in web apps. And if you look at just the CVEs as you're issued, you'll see problem with web app after web app after web app. It is tempting to blame the developer who made the mistake, but when you see the same types of mistakes occurring over and over again in different products in different areas, what it suggests to me is there are two problems, and that as an industry there are two things we're not learning at all from the past. The first is that there are these common design mistakes that keep being made over and over again, and we need to address that. I like to think of cars. If there was some sequence of buttons you could push in your car that made it crash, nobody would find it acceptable just to say, we'll teach people not to push the buttons in those ways. We'd be questioning why those buttons are there and why they work that way in the first place. The second related issue is just the whole architecture of how we're designing these web application frameworks. And you have things like WordPress, which have great inertia. I mean, they're big. It's almost if there's a reason you don't want to use WordPress, people are looking at you and going, well, why? Because everything uses WordPress, and I don't want to sound like I'm picking on WordPress. I've written about it when I'm talking about security architecture as well. WordPress is both an amazing success story and an example of a really poor security architecture. And like any other product, it depends what you're using it for. So, if you're using WordPress for your company website, and it's, there's no personal information on there, there's no payment card information, presumably you can back up and restore it pretty quickly if there's a problem, then maybe it's the right tool. I mean, I use WordPress as well, so I'm not trying to give anyone the impression that it's terrible. I use WordPress as well. One of the advantages is because it's so common, security problems tend to be found and fixed.
That is true.
So they tend to be found, they tend to be fixed, and that. But the problem happens when we have a business that wants to take something something like WordPress, and then, well, let's just layer this kind of private area on it, and we'll put some private information there, or we got this great plugin that turns it into e-commerce, and then that really emphasizes and brings to the forefront the fact that this application was not designed for that purpose, and it so I guess without going on too long on this, and to get off my soapbox for a minute, we need to start adopting more attack-resistant architectures and better design patterns so that we can we need to make hacking web apps a lot harder and a lot less frequent.
No, I agree, and I agree with your soapbox. I mean, one of the problems, if just going back to the WordPress ecosystem, is if you ever see a problem in WordPress, often the same problem comes out with Joomla and Drupal, because what people forget is it's the same PHP, it's the same MySQL interface, and often the problems are architecture based, not the system itself. No. And the other thing, interestingly enough, I had personally never gone through a hack on a WordPress site, on any site I've managed, in 5 years, until last October. And what happened was, the all discussion is, WordPress, for those who don't know, work on a system of plugins, which are basically code modules to do functions. And, the talk always is use paid plugins that everybody, where they're coming from, use free plugins that have been vetted. And there was this wonderful plugin called GDPR, which is the European privacy regulations. And the plugin got hacked. And this plugin had over 2 million installs at the time. And to be fair, most of the web hosting companies got wind of it, knew it was out there, cut it off. But unfortunately, guys like me who are with well-known hosting companies still got hit. So the point is, it can happen even if you do all the right things.
It can, and part of that is because of the architecture. And again, I don't want to pick on just WordPress. There's a whole bunch of apps. There's a whole bunch of apps out there that work this way. So you have a web server. The web server is right at the edge, right? It's communicating with your end user. That web server has the credentials to do anything it wants on the database. So now you have the database credentials essentially pushed out right to the edge of the network, and you're those credentials reside within the web server directory. So we're relying on proper web server configuration, not to just hand over those credentials and to execute them as PHP instead. And then we add to that the fact that as we add modules to WordPress or anything like WordPress, as you mentioned, we're actually adding executable code that varies in quality. Some of it may be the best code ever written, some of it may not be. So that's really, at any given time, with that type of architecture, you are literally you're one hack away from, you're one mistake away, one coding mistake away from a compromise. And that's why I mentioned, the concept of intrusion-resistant architectures, where you need to move beyond that paradigm where you're just one thing. If you think about your car, there's a reason there's more than one nut holding each wheel on. It is anticipated that one of those may fail. If you look at, physical safety systems, almost always the assumption that a single component might fail, and we need to think about architecting applications a little more the same way.
No, I would agree with you. And so I wanted to move into how do you, if you're going to use a platform like a WordPress, and yeah, you can pick on it all you want. I'm good with that, and or Joomla or Drupal or any of that. How should people go about protecting their web presence if they can? And then besides protecting their web presence, how much is the web hosting for those people who are going out and buying hosting? And it's something we stress in our business, in our agency, is to choose your web host very carefully because they're really part of your security solution. What do you think about those thoughts?
So, for the end consumer or businesses purchasing these, obviously you want to try to pick reputable products and keep them up to date, right? Those are two of the major components we've mentioned earlier. Another key message is backups. You need to have a backup of your site, and that backup of the site needs to be inaccessible from the site itself. So, you don't want to place yourself in a position where somebody's able to compromise your site and delete your backups while they're there, or use credentials that are found on the site to delete the backup. So that's the basic. What can you do? And as you've also mentioned, picking a hosting provider is important. Again, if you're going to use free open source software and a low cost hosting provider for a very simple website, for a small business that can quickly be recovered from a backup, well, maybe that's okay. And I understand that some small businesses are under incredible budget pressure, and they need to keep these costs down. But like in many other areas of business, you get what you pay for. And when you're dealing with a hosting provider, or a cloud provider of any sort, you're really dealing with a shared security model. If they are running the hardware and the operating system software in this particular case, and if you're just buying a hosting service, you're relying on them to keep that secure. And if that if they're not holding up that end of the bargain or the job, if they're not ensuring the security of those systems, then it's very difficult to end up with a secure result. And really, if you're crossing the line from a simple website into personal information, payment card transactions, etc., you need to consider every element of the service, and also realistically consider whether or not you have the skills in-house or you need some outside expertise to protect yourself. And it's very frustrating in the security field. Often run across businesses that are in a bit of a crisis, and if they had made a small investment up front to have someone with the right IT or the right security skills review their plans and help them make some of the decisions up front, it probably would have allowed them to avoid the pain they're in. Just like it often makes sense to have your lawyer review a contract before you sign it. That little bit of money you save up front could come back to could have been the cheapest insurance that you could have had along the course of that job.
I would agree with you, and I would also advise anybody listening to kind of do your homework. I'm not going to call them out by name, but most people can figure it. There's a well-known web host conglomerate that decided to start employing a product called SiteLock. And there were many customers out there, and these weren't just WordPress sites, these were all kinds of sites that never had a security vulnerability until this company employed SiteLock and said, by the way, if you install SiteLock, all your problems will go away and we'll charge you a couple $100 a year on top of what you're paying. And it turned out that this particular company got called out in many forums for actually creating false positives to sell their security software. And that's just not a no-no. So you got to do your homework and be very careful. I would also suggest if anybody's thinking about getting into creating a website, jump online, read some forums. The discussions of the 5 or 10 hosts that every developer likes are pretty well the same, no matter who you talk to, kind of thing. So,
I'm not familiar with that particular product, but I have run across similar issues with other security plugins for for products such as WordPress and third-party security plugins. I'm not poking at WordPress here, and have run into issues with false positives. And it just so happens that the company who publishes a plugin is very happy to help you with that alleged problem their product has found, if you pay them. So it's certainly somewhere to get some advice and understand what's going on, and don't trust don't trust that pop up on your screen or that free scanning product for your website. Don't trust that as gospel and from security matters.
I would agree with that. And the other thing is, again, on your website is to keep regular backups, because frankly, that can be your best avenue. And I would go so far, being in the website game as long as I've been in it, is to say don't trust your host to keep those backups. Do it yourself or get somebody to do it for you. Because there was actually a well-known web host in Australia called Malware IT, and about 6 or 7 years ago, they were hacked, and their backup server was also hacked at the same time. And this was an organized attempt. It wasn't a script kiddie, and the end result was they lost their backup server, and I think the number was somewhere around 300,000 impacted websites. And that's, so what I'm suggesting is make sure backups are part of your strategy, but keep your own as well.
And more generally, moving kind of up into not only hosting, but even any cloud provider, I urge people to ensure that they have backups outside of their cloud providing account, whether you're using Azure or using AWS, or whether you're using a hosting provider, using web host, have a backup somewhere else. Because there have been a number of scenarios where an account has been hacked. Now, it wasn't the server that was hacked; it was in fact the account at the hosting provider was hacked, and that may very well have been, in many cases, the fault of the customer, but it's not much of a consolation afterwards when you find out your account has been hacked and it may be your fault, but you've lost all of your data and all of your backups. And the other issue, particularly when you're dealing with the smaller low-cost hosting firms, is you don't really know for a fact that they're going to be around next month or next year, so you really want a backup of your site, your software, of your data somewhere that you can control, or in the hands of another provider, so that you're able to recover if there is a major impact at your provider.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to take that one more, not only have that backup in your hand, but having tried to do a restore of that backup to a test domain or some other place to prove that the backup's actually working. Because I've seen way too many occurrences in this business over the years where somebody did a backup. They never tried to restore process, and they tried to restore, and the restore didn't work. And that's not a good thing either.
Absolutely. Testing backups, it was a little more common when we used to back up a lot to magnetic media because of the failure rates, but testing backups, and even if you're using something like one of the, I won't mention another product name, I already mentioned it once, but if you're using an online backup service, at least so often, at least log in and make sure some of the files that you've recently created are there and that it's working as advertised.
Yep, that's good advice. So now that we've talked a little bit around, let's kind of look at the world geography a little bit. And one of the concerns I know many people have had is it the Russians causing all this havoc? Is it the Chinese causing all this havoc? And, we know the issues in the States. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. And we know the issues certainly with the Chinese, especially with companies like Lenovo, who's been implicated with malware. And for those who don't know, Lenovo's about 49% owned by the Chinese government. So we're saying that right off the top. It's also worth mentioning Lenovo is one of the biggest providers of PCs to healthcare providers in Ontario. So that's what we're talking about. And Huawei, and the news with them being in the forefront in their security issue, Is it the Chinese? Is it the Koreans? Is it the Russians? Where's the biggest threat coming from right now?
Well, that's a really good question. A lot of it depends on who you are and what business you're in. So, we read a lot about China. We read a lot about Russia. They are only two of many countries that are involved in cyber warfare. And I think, I don't think anyone is naive enough to say that, China and Russia bad, everyone else good. That's just, that would be nothing more than propaganda. So there are a lot of countries are involved in this. There's a number of things you've touched on. So one is there any particular country that concerns me more than others? Not really. Certainly if you're in certain lines of work or have certain specific concerns, you're more likely to see competitors in different countries that may be targeting you. But there are a number of countries in the world that where it has become quite obvious over time that they use government assets to help their major industries. As the individual, the average Canadian probably should be more concerned about criminals that are after phishing, malware, ransomware, and the reason I say that is, again, the game for these criminals is to make money.
Yep.
When we look at state-sponsored actions, they tend to be more around intelligence gathering and around intellectual property, as opposed to the type of things that the individual average Canadian should worry about, or American or citizen if for your international international listeners. So, I'm on a day-to-day basis, I'm more worried about criminals who want to get malware on my system and steal my information than I am any particular government. Obviously, if you're in certain industries, if you work in the defense industry, if you work in some of those others, then you have different concerns.
And I would even take that one further and say I'd even be concerned about receiving a phone call of somebody claiming they're from Microsoft and saying, we see X errors on your PC. Well, guess what? Every error log on a Windows PC has errors in them. So, and then they say to you, and by the way, please give us your credit card number and we'll gladly fix these errors and we'll remote to your PC. And what people don't realize is when they remote to your PC, not only do you give them their credit card number, which they can charge what they want to, they've probably installed a piece of malware, which gives them backdoor access to your computer, and the vicious cycle continues. So I think that's as much as right. And
exactly, fraud, and that's a good example of where social engineering, fraud, and malware all come together into the same scam. And as you mentioned, I will note that globally, the larger issue you mentioned with impacting some manufacturers is supply chain security. It is becoming more of a concern. I think it's more of a concern for large business than it is, but we do need to recognize that a very large percentage of our hardware is being built overseas, and it's hard to avoid. I don't think I've yet run across a computer made in Canada or that is completely made in the United States. So that's part of the landscape that we live in. We certainly hope that some of the major manufacturers that we know, love, and trust are doing their best to secure their supply chain and are monitoring what's going on in their production facilities. But it's just something to keep on the back of our minds, especially if we're if we're in an industry where we're dealing with highly sensitive information.
Yeah, so true. Eric, thanks a lot for your time today. It's been a great informative chat. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, wants to use your services, how's the best way to get a hold of you right now?
Best way to reach me right now would be to surf over to securityshelf.com. That's one word, or two words combined to one, securityshelf.com. And if you use the contact form there, your message will reach me.
Yeah, and Eric's really knowledgeable, and don't be afraid. And thanks again, Eric. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you for listening to the SDM Interview Show. This podcast is a production of StunningDigitalMarketing.com, the agency that can help you with your web design, WordPress security, and digital marketing needs. Please subscribe to this podcast. This podcast can be found on Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and more. Please don't miss the next edition. This podcast comes out every Thursday for your listening enjoyment. Until next time, please keep your feet on the ground and keep reaching for the stars. And we'll talk to you all soon. Have a great week, everybody. Bye for now.